The way that we're going to use the time that we've now got is that David Pitt-Watson, the author of the report, is going to speak to it, and then we've got a distinguished panel of 3 people who are going to respond to it for 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have a Q&A, and we'll get you out of here by 9:45 at the latest. So, let me just turn now to the author of the report and star of the Today programme and various other media outlets this morning, Radio Wales, is that right?
That was the
yeah, that's right. David Pitt-Watson, as you know, is Chair of Hermes Focus Asset Management. He was formerly head of all Hermes shareholder activist activities, the largest stewardship programme of any fund manager in the world. He's enjoyed a varied business career, both as a prominent city investor and as a senior strategic advisor, and he's advised leading policymakers on issues of industrial and financial policy for more than 20 years. And even there was a brief period during that time when he and I worked together. David.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you all very much for coming along. I love presenting in this room with all the paintings around it. You know, it was built, I don't know, a couple of 100 years ago, and very much in the tradition of the RSA, the sort of the promotion of the arts and sport and dancing and music. And then sort of we've got a sort of heaven and hell picture here, where you've got the great thinkers over on the left, and then you've got the deep blackness that we have if people are not critical and raising issues. But the key thing that I rather love is that the people that founded the RSA saw commerce as being part of the way that you solved the problem. And if you look over at that painting there, you'll see sort of the explorers, Captain Cook, coming out of the Thames, wondering why anybody stuck him in there by the look on his face. And you have Mercury Hermes, who's the god of commerce, doing sort of dress down Friday in inappropriate clothes for weather like today, who's overseeing all of that. So commerce was going to be the answer to some of our problems. And look, it's in that sort of tradition, really, that I think we come to thinking about where we are with pensions. Because we started this by talking to a bunch of people through a series of citizens' juries about what they wanted from the pension system. So this started, as Matthew said, a couple of years ago with citizens' juries and talking about, you know, what is it that folk want? Because we have an enormous pension system in the UK. I mean, we've got £2 trillion that are invested for private pensions, and each year we add 6.5% of our GNP to private pensions, and we need to, because the state pension has got the lowest replacement ratio of any country in the OECD. But private pension provision is really expensive for poorer people, and occupational pensions only cover half the population. Hopefully, when we've got a auto-enrollment from 2012, that'll be addressed. But if you go back to what the citizens' jury people wanted, at the end it was really simple. What they wanted was a system they could trust. Like a doctor, they would say. And when I come back and said, well, you know, you need to have people in the city like doctors, they say, oh, that's completely impossible. But maybe like John Lewis. They want something where they can say, here's my money, I'd like to give it to you, and I know that you're on my side, and you'll do the best that you possibly can with this money. And you'll do that through an architecture of pensions that's likely to produce a decent return for me in my retirement. But actually, if you look at the return that the typical British person is likely to get, and the typical return that somebody who lives in a country where the pension system is properly designed is concerned, they're very different. So if a typical Dutch person, typical British person save exactly the same amount of money in exactly the same proper way from 25 through to 65 and then they retire, the Dutch person ends up with 50% more than would the British person. But given that that's so, it seems to me in many ways that's good news. Because this problem in the pension system in Britain can be solved, and it can be solved by thinking about how people do it in other countries. I'll come to that in just a minute, but I'd like just to stop for a while. We're not trying to answer all the questions that arise on pensions policy at the RSA. Absolutely not. There are big questions about the dependency ratio. If we all live to be 100, then how long can we retire for? How long do we need to work for? There's big questions about collective benefits. If middle-class people live longer than working-class people, is that not regressive? And of course, it's quite interesting that those that represent poorer people have supported collective benefits even where they are regressive, because for poorer people, the pension is so fundamental to their well-being. There's a big debate about the debate between state and private pensions. All that we're going to talk about, though, is about how it is that you get the best value provision from non-state pensions, the best value private pensions. And you always want the best value private pensions. No matter how you answer any of those other questions, you always want the best value private pensions, it seems to us. And you know, I think most people would say, if you came 20 years ago, you would say that the British occupational pension system, which was the core, was actually quite a strong one. In fact, I think the recent NAPF had it as the envy of the world. And those of you, many of you in this audience who are my age or older will remember that the employer typically put aside 9%, the employee typically put aside 6%, and we targeted a final salary pension that you were going to be paid at 1/60th per year in which you'd been investing. But in the 90s and the noughties, those pensions were very well funded, and a deal was done which the government was complicit, which was that we weren't going to keep funding them, we were going to take pension fund holidays. And the trustees of the pension fund naturally said, well, if you're going to do that, you need to promise to me that that benefit is going to be paid. And so that promise was made. And we moved from a system where there was a target to a hard promise on a DB pension. Then, of course, people started living for longer, returns went down, and outside of the public sector, we've closed down those DB schemes. And we've replaced them with individual savings account type pensions. Many, many, many different sorts of pensions. Small, large, trustee-based, contract-based. And these have proved inadequate. A few may be good, but many are simply not. In design, in structure, in the contribution that's being made to them, which is typically lower for these than it would have been for the old DB schemes, and in the cost of management. And that's the problem that we need to address. I mentioned costs. And something we keep coming back to in this RSA study is that costs matter a lot. Right from the very first citizens' jury, when it was explained to people that this charge on your pension, this 1 or 2% a year that you think you're paying, compounds every year. So that if you pay 1.5% per year from age of 25 through to the age of 85 when your life expectancy is over, that 1.5% a year will eat up 38% of the potential pension that you might have got. Now, if you have 2%, it'll be about 50%. If you have 3%, actually by that stage the compounding works so that it's about 65%, something of that nature. So costs matter a lot. One of the things that adds to cost is the way in which you're enrolled. If there's an automatic enrollment, then that's very, very cheap, very, very low cost to enroll somebody in a pension. And by the way, if there isn't automatic enrollment, not only is it costly, but it can also lead to perverse incentives for people who are selling pensions. Because once you've sold somebody one pension, somebody else will come around, and rather like the builder that said, who did this terrible job for you, they're going to come around and say, well, I'm going to try and sell you a better pension. Adds to costs again. Investment returns matter a lot. With an ISA-style pension, you are forced into an annuity, and annuities give very low returns and very variable returns, partly because of high costs. There was an article 2 or 3 months back saying that annuity returns had fallen by 50% in the past 8 years. So somebody 8 years ago who thought they were saving enough now discovers they have half the pension bought from their savings pot. And also the nature of the promise matters, because an ISA pension is your own account. If you were to die when you were young, why, that would be in your will. It's not in that sense a pension, it's a savings account. And if you want to save that way, that's fine, but you'll need to save more because it's more expensive to do it that way. So how is it that we then get these key factors into a good pension design? Well, if you want low costs, as I said, you need auto-enrollment. You need scale as well. A pension fund for 10 people costs a whole load more than a pension fund for 500,000 people. And ideally as well, you'd like to be collectively invested, because a collective investment pot, in terms of its reporting and all the rest of it to individuals, that costs less to run. If you want maximum return, so that you're not forced into annuities, so that as people get older, they don't need to invest hugely conservatively because they share that with other people, again, you'd like a collectively run scheme. Just like our DB schemes used to be collectively run schemes, just like in Holland and in Denmark, we have collectively run schemes. Also, if this is going to work, it isn't just a question of someone legislating. There needs to be trust right through the system. The legislation can create the framework, but we need more than that. We need something where people know, as in the citizens' jury, that if they give their money to somebody, they can trust that person is on their side, first and foremost. And we have a law for doing that, and that's a trustee law, so we need trustee-like governance. Pensions should be pensions, not ISA. And by the ways, they need to be responsibly invested. My history, as you heard from Matthew at Hermes, is essentially about responsible investment. And I started this project thinking that we were going to embark on something where citizen investors were telling us, I would like my pension hugely responsibly invested. Well, they did tell us that. But they said, David, before you get to that, I want to know that this is a good deal, that the basic structure of the pensions is a good deal. But they need to be responsibly invested. There's absolutely no point in investing people's money in stock markets that are declining while everybody tries to outperform them by 1%. If we're not thinking about how it is that as share owners, as bond owners, we're carrying out our duties as good owners on behalf of investors, why we simply aren't going to make the return. And then finally, we're going to need providers who will be able to do these and who will deliver the goods. What's the goods? Pretty straightforward. It's large, auto-enrolled, low cost, probably collective, trust-based pensions, which are responsibly invested. That's what we need to be going for in this country. Now, we've already made quite a lot of progress on this. By 2012, auto-enrollment will be implemented in this country. But there's a bit of a problem here, because we're not saying that those who are selling auto-enrolled pensions need to have scale and deeply low costs. We're not saying that at all. So there are auto-enrolled pensions that can potentially be being sold out there that will simply not be the good pensions that we're looking for. Of course, we have created Nest, and it will sell good pensions. But what we've created is something that looks like a weakened government monopoly rather than healthy competition. And in this I quote Elizabeth Corley, who's head of investment at Allianz, which is the biggest insurer, I think, in Europe. And it's weakened because Nest won't be allowed to take more than £3,600 adjusted for inflation. I think it's £4,200 now, from any individual in any year. So imagine you go to an employer and you say, well, here we are, Nest, we've got a great deal for you here, but you're the chief executive and you earn £60,000 a year. Okay, well, you should be setting aside 15% ideally. 15% ideally, that'd be £9,000. So you're going to need 2 pension systems in this company if we're going to cover you as well as anybody else. And at that, of course, the administration becomes costly and so on and so and so. So we've got Nest, but then, unfortunately, we've weakened it. And, of course, Nest is not a collective system, and if it were a collective system, it would be able to offer still higher returns. Nest can't offer those collective returns. Why? Because collective defined contribution, big collective schemes where you don't make a hard promise, are currently not permissible under our legislation. Now, there's a reason that that legislation is there. It's there because, obviously, if you set up a dodgy collective DC scheme with no promises, you can turn it into something that looks close to a Ponzi scheme because you take the money out early and you leave the people that are contributing afterwards. But you know, that's kind of like telling somebody that driving a car means that you're driving a lethal weapon. If we have people who are running collective DC schemes in trust, properly regulated, this is the best way and the lowest cost way to run pensions. On the government's own numbers, a collective DC scheme will return 39% higher pensions than one that is sold individually. So for the government also to be saying that these should be not permissible under current legislation seems to us to be an error. But if we're going to get this to work, it's not just about the government. The government is a necessary but by far a sufficient condition in all of this. And the point of what we've published today is about how it is that we pull a consensus together about the future of pensions. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got the National Association of Pension Funds and the TUC and the CBI here today. It's really important that we all agree on the architecture so that we can tell those people, that from the citizens' jury and from the populace, that when they enroll in a pension, that this is something that works and that they can trust. And these are hugely important stakeholders in this. I have to say the NEPF, I think, over the last couple of years has been doing some fantastic work on this, particularly their super trust proposal, but if you look at some of their other publications, are entirely consistent with what it is that we're saying, particularly about scale and low costs. The TUC and the CBI, I mean, they're here today. You know, if you're an employer and an employee and you've just gone through the closure of all these DB schemes, you've got a lot that you can disagree about. And I understand that, and as a worker representative, the TUC's got to take one line, and as an employer representative, the CBI's got to take another line. But actually what's intrigued me is the number of trade union and employer representatives who are now coming out and saying, listen, we need to find a new future, the post-DB future, that offers people decent pensions. And look, this is just big society. It's the TUC looking after their members, voluntary members. And it's the CBI as employers, frankly saying, we are the only people who can manage to offer decent pensions. You've got to use occupational pensions as the pillar of private pension provision. They'll need the government. And look, I would praise both this government and the last for some of the reforms they've introduced. In fact, the really difficult one, which is auto-enrollment, that is a really, really tough reform, and I praise the government hugely for having done that. But getting the detail of this right is crucially important. And pensions is always a long-term problem. If you don't make a decision in pensions for 6 months or a year, you'll get away with it. And it's very technically complex. And there have been 9 DWP ministers in the past 10 years. So there's lots of detail out there, and the government does need to get its mind around that. But the solution isn't difficult. And so we're asking the government to consider a relaxation on Nest, to allow the creation of effective competition of a limited number of suppliers who can also offer proper low-cost pensions. They should at least investigate with an aim to allowing the provision of collective DC by people who are trustee-based and we can be assured of what it is that they're doing. And by the ways, if I was them, I would have thought one step forward that you could take would be to commission an explicitly cross-party commission, explicitly including the CBI, the TUC, and the National Association of Pension Funds, and explicitly trying to iron out some of the details that go beyond this. They are important details, but the structure is there, and I think the structure is clear. If you do, I am absolutely delighted that a year ago, we've been working on this for 2 years, a year ago, APG from Holland got interested in our work and has been sponsoring it for a year, and ATP from Denmark has just joined them and actually has now established an office in the UK. So I hope that the UK industry will be the supplier of good new pensions. But I'm absolutely delighted that the leading providers from those 2 countries, which are recognized as leading countries in providing good pensions are now here just in case they might not. What now? Well, this is a huge prize. We can have, on quite conservative numbers, something like a 50% improvement in our pensions, private pensions, DC pensions, at no extra cost. I mean, just in macroeconomic terms, a 50% improvement on 6.5% of the GNP is stunning. But in human and individual terms, in terms of the sort of life that people can expect in retirement, it's also hugely important. We need everyone to come together on this. Politicians, CBI, TUC, we need the media, we need public opinion as well. People need to know what's a good pension, what's a poor pension. We need a consensus, and then we need to act. And our job at the RSA is always only to catalyze these things, to embolden enterprise, to enlarge science, to refine arts, to improve manufacture, and to extend our commerce. That's what these paintings were about, because extending our commerce properly would be to the benefit of humankind. This is a really huge opportunity that we have in the UK to get a new system of pensions, to get a consensus for a new system of pensions, which will be to everyone's benefit. I have certainly enjoyed working on this so far, and I look forward to working with CBI, TUC, NEPF, and all of you in the future as we go forward with this work. And thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you, David. Thanks, David. That was very clear. We've now got 3 short responses before we open up for a discussion. First of all, on my left, we have Lindsay Tomlinson, who's Managing Director of BlackRock. Lindsay has had a range of senior management roles at BGI over more than 20 years prior to its acquisition by BlackRock. He's been pensions actuary and is a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries. He moved into the investment roles in 1981 and joined BGI in 1987. Besides his BlackRock activities, Lindsay is chairman of the National Association of Pension Funds and a director of the Financial Reporting Council. Lindsay.
Thank you. What I'm going to say is not necessarily NAPF policy and probably not BlackRock policy either. Both of those organisations have to be very careful about what already exists. So if you're looking forward, I can afford to be more radical. Having said that, from an NAPF perspective, we're in strong agreement with what David has said. I found it interesting that the work that David described started from looking at governance and responsible investment, whereas the NAPF's work has actually come from looking at what is the best possible structure for pension provision. And the NAPF in particular is very strongly in favour of workplace pension provision. That's our rationale. We think that the workplace is by far the best place to actually put people in a position to address their retirement savings needs. The thrust of the NAPF policy has been sort of 2 major areas. The first one is that we think we need to make things much, much more simple. And this in particular applies to the state pension arrangements, where I haven't a clue what I'm going to get from the state when I finally reach whatever age it is that I'm going to get paid something. And for the average man in the street, that would be a sort of slightly embarrassing admission. But when you're chairman of the NAPF, it really is pretty shocking. And the reason is that this thing is just far too complicated. So we have to simplify the state arrangements, and commensurately then we can simplify workplace arrangements and other arrangements. And then secondly, we need to work very hard to get costs out of the system. And essentially we need to scale up what we're doing. We need to get costs out, both the straightforward costs, distribution, investment costs and so on that David talked about, and we also need to be able to afford for these arrangements to govern themselves properly. A lot of the current pension arrangements we've got in the UK are just too small to afford to govern themselves properly, and so as a result of that they're unlikely to produce very good investment returns. So simplicity and scale, and then underpinning all of that at the NAPF is a desire to keep all of this in the wholesale marketplace rather than the retail marketplace. A lot of the cost elements that David's talked about are what happens when you go into the market for a retail pension and you basically get killed. And the NAPF is really trying to promote wholesale pension provision, which we've had through the DB funds, through the big DB funds in the past, and we need to carry on down that route. So simplicity, scale, and keeping this in the wholesale market. How this is being presented as NAPF policy, firstly, simplification. We've had the idea for state pension, basic state pension, called either a foundation pension or a citizen's pension of around £140 a week, and trying to eliminate lots of means-tested benefits, which we've had out there for about 5 years now. And Steve Webb, to be fair, I think it might have been his idea in the first place, adopted by the NAPF, but he's picked up on it and is trying to address it. And I know from the point of view of the Treasury this is pretty difficult, but I think being radical in this area is worth trying, and it would be an enormous win if we could simplify the state arrangements and commensurately private arrangements on top of them. And then we've also pushed this idea of the super trust, which is consolidating the pension arrangements that are out there. I think we should run half a dozen super trust arrangements in this country, operating at scale. It's axiomatic that the benefits that they provide would either have to be defined contribution or collective defined contribution, but this would be a way forward. And if you went down that route, it would also put you in a position to address the corporate governance and responsible investing issues that David started with. And just a final remark is that I think the root cause of the problem that we've got is that we have, on the one hand, the individual who is seeking or needs to save, and on the other, we have the investee company or whoever is going to use the assets that are to be invested. And in the middle, we've got the financial services industry. And those representing the individual at one end of this value chain are just too small. They don't have enough clout to deal with the financial services industry on even terms, and so they tend to get gobbled up by it. And my vision would be that we scale up those representing the individual investor so that they can deal with the financial services industry on their own terms. And this is what happens around the world with people like the Norwegian Oil Fund, the Ontario State Teachers, the big Dutch funds. And we need funds of that kind of scale operating in this country. And Nest is a first step, but I have concerns about its monopoly supplier position. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Okay, great. So on my immediate right, Nigel Stanley has been Head of Campaigns and Communications at the TUC since May 1997. His department is responsible for media relations, new media, public affairs, publications, events and exhibition organisation. Nigel said much of the TUC's work on pensions, particularly the 2012 reform package. He was a member of the consumer panel of the Personal Accounts Delivery Authority. Nigel.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Well, can I first of all say the TUC gives this report a very warm welcome. It's not often when I'm speaking about pensions that I can justify using the adjective exciting, because I think that possibly would be over-egging it, but I think we can with this report. I think it genuinely should be a game changer for the British pension system. And I'd like to say straight away that the TUC would be a very willing participant in the journey that David has invited us to go along today to see what we can do to make this a reality. I think the report's got a very good analysis, one of the best actually, in fact, quite short pages of what's happened to the UK pension system. But as we all know, the DB pensions have declined, and unions do plead guilty to trying to hang on to them. And to some extent, that's because what the alternatives has often been so poor. And although we actually have produced guides to kind of negotiating a good DC pension, in fact, the only game on there is a DC pension with all the weaknesses that David so well described. And I think the other, although we have this picture, if you read the press, it's all about the switch from DB to DC. There's two other switches that have been actually more important to that. One is, frankly, just a decline in pensions coverage altogether. And we now have 2 out of 3 private sector workers with no employer support for their pension. Now that is a pensions crisis waiting to happen. And the other thing we've seen is a switch from trust-based DC to contract-based DC as well, which hardly anyone has remarked on as a big policy trend outside the narrow world of pensions anoraks. But it's a very significant change in the delivery of pensions and produces all kinds of different incentives into it, which I think we've really not talked about enough. So it's no betrayal of our defence of DB where we can to say that DC is now the main game in town and that we need to have a policy response to that. And with auto-enrolment, we are going to have many more millions of workers in DC schemes. And I think that's where the policy debate now is. I mean, again, there's been lots of discussion about can we deregulate DB pensions and save them in that way? I think it's too late to use the language of saving. DC is now where it's at, and it's how do you make DC better should be where the energy from pensions policy experts should come. Now, I think David's report has got an absolutely compelling analysis of what's wrong. But the difficult question is how do we get there? This is where the politics comes in. I mean, I'm someone who kind of moves in and out of the policy and politics world. And people in the policy world are always fantastically frustrated because we've designed this brilliant policy and no one's doing anything about it. So how do you get from here to there? Now, I think this is where the real difficulties and obstacles are here today, because it's not obvious to me that it benefits anyone enough to get through all the processes that we need. It's clearly a better system, but where do the pressure points come? There's no, I think, market pressure to do this. Indeed, there's probably vested, I mean, we talk about the charges, and I don't particularly want to kind of get into a big argument today, but those charges are going somewhere, and some people have a vested interest in those charges continuing to go to them. So I think there's kind of obstacles built into the system too. And whilst I think employers clearly would like to get the best possible pension for what they put into it, and I don't doubt that at all, I don't see the big incentives on employers to do a lot about this, given all the other things they have to worry about as well. So where are the pressures? Well, I think government has got a duty here. I think there's an awful lot of people around government, I think across parties, who recognise that there's a ticking DC pension time bomb. People are seeing more and more of their pensions going into DC pots. They're even getting these statements saying, gosh, you've got a lot of money in your pot, and yet when they come to annuitise these pensions, as most will, as kind of not annuitising, it's a game only really for a very tiny minority, they're going to see they get tiny pensions. And there is going to be a political kickback at some stage unless something does something about that. So how do we get there? Well, I don't have a blueprint for this, and I think that's the next stage of the journey, is working that out. But it seems to me that there are a number of things that we should be thinking about. We do need some changes in the law. I think the report is absolutely right to say we need to liberate Nest, because although I think, I'm not sure that Nest is a monopoly supplier, Nest has got a monopoly public duty to service every small disorganised employer in Britain, which is a huge cost on it. And I think then to be hobbled as well by not allowing to have kind of contributions in and be a pension scheme that can serve the staff of all the staff of an employer is a big mistake. So how do we get there? Well, I've got two ideas, and I think that you could even call them nudge ideas, as I'm kind of getting with the programme, or trying to. The first one is you look at the qualifications for schemes that can auto-enrol. And I think you start reducing the charges that they are allowed to charge, and I think that drives economies of scale, because only big schemes will then be able to meet those. And secondly, at one point you say that you're only going to allow to auto-enroll into pensions that are trust-based. And I think those two things together may be enough to drive it. I think we need to do more, but they seem to me two things that a government could do. Now, we need time, we need notice. I'm absolutely of the idea that pensions policy has to be done in a slow, phased way. You can't rush things, you have to build consensus. But it seems to me that at least those are two tools that we can be thinking about. And if there are others, happy to look at those, happy to think about those, happy to talk it through, happy to try and build consensus. But I think there is an urgency to this as well. I mean, yes, we have to think about it in a strategic, phased way, but we also have to achieve it, and we have to start doing that now.
Nigel, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so then finally, for the last 5 minutes before we open it up, Mario Lopez is a Senior Policy Advisor at the CBI, working in the Employment Policy Directorate, and he has particular responsibility for the team's work on UK and EU pensions policy. Mario.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for inviting me today. First of all, I think to say that David's report is very timely. I think we have seen DB deficits growing really badly during the financial crisis. We're seeing a lot of questions around the pension system during the last 2 or 3 years. And now that we're seeing sort of surpluses coming back, we're seeing cash flow being restored, I think it's a very good point to sort of take a step back and say, where are we going forward with the UK pension system? I think I'll agree with what Nigel said. I think DB is not going to be revived anymore. I think some employers might still keep it, but it will be a minority sport. I think the future is on DC and what kind of DC we want for the UK. Again, I think David's report hits all the right notes in terms of what are the key issues and key concerns we should be looking at all together as an industry and broadly between employees and employers as well. That is the issue around the hard promise of DB that David has spoken about, and how we are going to be looking at DC. And if this new DC is going to become the new DB, then we have a bit of a problem, because a lot of employers are not going to like that. And this is something that should always stay in the back of our mind when we're discussing what we want to do with the new DC, whether it's collective DC or any of the ideas around that. I want to sort of perhaps look at this from a perspective of where are we going from here. I think David's report looks at exactly the right issues. What I would like to put out there are certain concerns that probably the CBI will be putting in this kind of debate. We'll say, well, how are we going to solve this? And these are not questions to be obviously resolved by the RSA. This is a bit to do with both employees, employers, government, the pensions regulator, and the industry as a whole. And so I thought it might be good to maybe outline a few of these so we can all start thinking about them next time that David gives us a call and says, can you come down and let's discuss this. I think the way we're looking at pensions industry in the UK at the moment, we're looking at individual DC, contract-based DC. It's what, frankly, employers are looking at. I think that the tide is going that way, and if we really want to make sure that people are embracing another type of DC, are looking at something different after the, in a sense, betrayal of what was the original DB and what has become now for employers and what it means for, and we're looking here at the broader economic impact of pensions, then we really need to look at some questions, and ask the tough questions here. I've divided them into 3 bits, which are employee engagement, employer engagement, and government engagement or regulatory engagement. From an employee engagement, I would say, are we looking at total reward? Are we looking at lifetime saving, for example? Now, I'm not saying that you should not be saving on a pension itself, but whether, if you look at an employee who's saying, I want to save for my first car, then I want to save for my first house, then I want to save for my pension, my children's college, is there, are we thinking sort of a bit broader in how that person is going to be saving onwards, or whether they're thinking pension is too far away for me to concern myself with it at the age of 25? Now, we think collective DC is a good way perhaps to look at, say, I will give you the money and I don't need to bother with that. I will make sure that I can focus on saving for my house, my children's college, etc., etc. So there are some questions to be thought about that. There's also the issue about labour mobility. The UK's workforce is no longer the type of person that will go into a company and stay there for 30, 40 years. We are looking at a very highly mobile workforce. Is individual DC the answer for that type of person? If they can take the pots away to different companies at the same time, maybe collective DC can do it. But we have to look at whether it matches that highly mobile workforce that we have at the moment. From an employer engagement side, well, I mean, I represent employers, and when I talk to CBI members, first thing they're concerned about at the moment is how they're going to sort out their DB deficit. A lot of them are starting to think about what to offer next, but without solving DB deficits and the impact that that has on the company's accounts, there's going to be very little that you can do to focus them on what's going forward from there. Within that, we need to look at the active management of employee relations as well within this sort of broader pensions crisis with what DB has become as a hard promise, as David was speaking about. On one side is reward for current staff. If you look at a lot of employers today are using the money that the company is producing is being used to pay for the pension of deferreds and pensioners of their DB scheme, and is not being used to pay for example, rewarding their current staff that are not on those DB pension, but rather in a DC pension. So you look, for example, I had one of our CBI members up in the Northeast who said to me, we went here into this financial crisis, and my employees have worked really, really hard and have kept this company going. We haven't made any single redundancies at all. We have kept the same members, but we froze pay for 3 years in a row. These same staff have got us out of this recession, and we are growing again. But that money that I have now, that surplus that I could use to give them a bigger reward, I cannot use it to give it to them. I have to use it to pay for a deficit on my defined benefit scheme, which is completely formed by deferreds and pensioners. Now, it is right that these deferreds and pensioners should get the pension. No one is saying that they should not. But how can that CEO justify, from a moral perspective, to their employees that have taken a frozen salary for 3 years, that after working so hard for 3 years, they're not going to get any of the benefit? So this is another question that we need to look at, and employers, and the reason I say this is because we're going to be talking about collective DC going forward, and I'll go into the regulatory in a second, we need to think that employers are very wary of going into a system that might become DB. They want something that is going to let them give that flexibility, and we need to look at that, because if you create collective DC and it becomes DB, that is going to be the end of pensions in the UK, because employers are really, really concerned about that. Finally, to say, looking at the regulatory certainty area, I think there is a big problem, which is there is a distrust of government from a pensions regulation perspective. We have seen over the last 2 decades, people have over-regulated the system. We talk about trust law and how we can encourage that, but government and the regulator, and we understand that the regulator and government are there to supervise and make sure that the promises stay as it is. But they haven't trusted trust law themselves, and they have put in place a lot of regulation over on top of each other. So we can reinvigorate trust law, but we need to make sure that government trusts that same law that employers and employees have trusted. We cannot say trust law is the solution, but then government regulates that trust law because they don't trust the trustees that they're being there. So I think from that side, these are the big questions. I think that's what we're looking at. In terms of design, finally, just to say, is the question of portability within collective DC. And this is red flags I want to put out, because when I was reading the report, it came up in my mind, has been new EU regulation around portability. Will we be able to take funds out of collective DC, and if so, what will be the impact on it? And we really need to take a hard look at intergenerational risk, because I think this is where the key matter is, how we're going to be able to balance younger and older workforce within the demographics of all of these. So, to finish, conclude the whole idea is, I think the report is good. We think that the analysis there on the CVI will always answer any call for contributing towards further work on this. But there are some tough questions out there, and we should really, all as an industry, start looking at this, because this is the right moment to do that, and I think David's report has kicked off that debate very nicely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. Okay, we've got 10 or 15 minutes for a conversation. So feel free to chip in. If you do, just wait for the microphone to come to you. There's someone here, Jenna.
I'd just like to say it's an extremely interesting report, and I guess it will be influential, obviously. I just had one...
could you just tell us who you are?
Yeah, my name's Tony Silverman, Standard & Poor's Equity Research. I just had one real question for, is it David? I'd be very interested if you could expand on what exactly it is that's not legal at the moment regarding collective schemes that matters for the model that you're proposing. And just flicking through the material, I'm wondering if a large part of it is or is not the ability to invest in equities for annuities in payment or close to payment in a collective scheme which does not have capital. And in passing, I'd offer the observation that as far as I understand it, the way that circle is squared in the Dutch system is that an annuity is offered with the possibility of cost of living increases, but those increases are not guaranteed. Whereas they are in a lot of arrangements out there at the moment. So I'd be interested to hear a lot more about that.
David?
There's really two questions. What's the problem in the UK, and how do they do it in Holland and Denmark? I mean, the problem in the UK is essentially it is at least legally cumbersome. My quote was from a DWP a publication that said not permissible to open a collective DC scheme unless there is a hard promise to it in the UK.
So that's illegal unless there's a hard promise? Unless
there is a hard promise. So we have collective schemes, but they're defined benefit schemes. A collective defined contribution scheme is what you can't do here. Now, how is that dealt with in other countries? Well, first of all, look, in Holland they have historically been well funded, but actually your point is absolutely right, that you do need to be able to say to people, listen, we've gone through difficult circumstances, we need to reduce the payment that we're making. I was in a debate about this only last week. You'll remember that annuity rates have fallen by 40 or 50% in the last 7 or 8 years in the UK, so if you were having an individual DC, your expectation of a pension has absolutely collapsed. In Holland, with a CDC, it's reduced by 6%. So in Holland, they've got a problem. It's not the perfect system, but they have got a degree of flexibility. In Denmark, they have a very intriguing thing, which is that they actually do promise a minimum pension. And they use the swaps market to be able to protect against that. But if I start talking about that, it'll be gobbledygook. Morten Nielsen is here from ATV in Denmark, and I'm sure he can explain that to you.
It was very interesting, I think, when we went into the department, David, that there seemed to be an almost explicit recognition that although all the evidence would point to a collective provision, a soft promise leading to higher pensions, it was the kind of risk, the kind of governmental risk of being seen not to be making a hard promise. So we're in this peculiar position where everybody kind of knows that we could be offering a better deal to people, but rather than offering a better deal, it's going to risk avoidance from the kind of governmental perspective.
Yeah, I think there's that.
Which is why you need to raise public awareness, because the public needs to understand that it has to accept a certain amount of risk if it's going to have a better value system.
Exactly. The governance, the level of trust are critical to how much you can get out of a pension system. If you want to have it contract-based and highly regulated, you'll simply end up with a pension system that doesn't do the job very well.
Okay, there's someone there. Yep.
It's coming through now. Ian Coleman from PricewaterhouseCoopers. One of the things that I did a few years ago was cost the NEST proposals for government, and that, obviously the detail of that has to be confidential, but the generality of the findings I think are fairly blindingly obvious, which is that as the scheme grows in size, then the cost per person begins to fall. And one of the issues that you highlight is, whilst it's clear what the end point might be that is attractive, how do you get from A to B? So could you say a little bit more about how you see that transition might take place, given that we've got fiscal austerity, the incentive for government to move towards an ad valorem charging basis, which is more unconstrained, I would have thought is quite high, because the quicker you can get that scheme to scale, the government's upfront investment in meeting its costs are going to be minimised. So if we can't get a political agreement now, when could you? It ought to be the most attractive time. But if you do that, what is the potential impact on the rest of the providers in the insurance industry for whom volumes would immediately tail off? And how do you square that particular political dimension, I suppose?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, Your point's absolutely right. I think it's 700 million, is it, that we're lending to Nest, which they'll hold on to for some time to set it up. And then by not allowing it to compete properly, I mean, presumably that number would be considerably lower if it was allowed to take higher. And I'd be very interested if you can tell us anything about how much we might save in public expenditure by just allowing Nest to do that. But it does seem to me that if you did do that, and if the government is promoting auto-enrollment and promoting Nest, it should also allow that there are perhaps a limited number, super trusts, for example, as Lindsay's talking about, of other people who are able to offer similar sorts of schemes at similar low costs. And I think Nest has now established that it's going to be charging 2% of your contribution and then 30 basis points of your pot, which is a very, very reasonable charge indeed, although difficult to explain to people. We ought to have a number of providers who I think were registered as being good enough to be able to do that. That would meet Nigel's thing about making sure that if there's auto-enrollment, it's always auto-enrollment into a good pension. And it would also allow for some choice. But I think you probably need competition where experts can look at the pension that you're going to provide and then say, okay, well, you're one of the people that we're going to allow to be able to offer this from 5 or 6 that are there. Same way that we would do for people that were going to do a mobile network or run a rail franchise. I mean, this is quite a common way of doing it. So that might be a mechanism that you'd use. But there'd be others, and I'd be really open to any mechanism that people wanted to use. It's just we need to see that where we're getting to is loads of economies of scale, cost reduction passed on to savers, trying to get down to 50 basis points or less like Nest.
Okay, I've got lots of hands and we're running out of time, so we'll raffle through them.
Right, thanks. I'm Paul Maloney from Nautilus International, which is a trade union that represents seafarers in both the UK and the Netherlands. My point is that if the situation described by David does produce such an improvement in return, then surely we then have the opportunity to make some guarantees, and that we're not concentrated on pure DC, because my concern is I disagree with Mario slightly in that I don't think employers are fearful of DB, end of. I think what employers are actually fearful of is inappropriate and over-regulation. And if we can produce a better return with a modest level of guarantee that is then properly and appropriately regulated, then surely there's a consensus that can be built around that, because you deliver value for money for employers who can better see the outcome of the money they're investing, and of course a degree, not as great as in the past, but a degree of security for employees. So surely if we can take the steps that have been described, we have the opportunity to go that one step further and build in a level of guarantee, as I say, modest, but then appropriately regulated.
Let's take 2 or 3 together. So we pass the microphone forward.
Bridget Benson, ethical investment specialist and new fellow for the RSA. I'd like to just pick up on that last point.
Could you hold the microphone a bit closer to your mouth?
I'd like to pick up on the last point because I think it's a very important one, and it was one thing that I was going to raise, which is if there's going to be a strong reliance on stock markets and the dangers of over-reliance on gilts and so on, is it not possible to have a with-profits style model which the Prudential can still deliver? They've got a fund with 70 billion in it, and I think if they can do it, then why can't such a huge scheme deliver similar kinds of benefits?
Okay, and then we'll just take that one there, and then we'll have one more round after this.
Patrick McIntosh, and I'm an IFA. 2 things. Firstly, I'm dealing with people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who've got anything up to 6 different pension schemes. And if I was talking to Lindsay, I'd have to be able to advise him about his OAP benefits. The cost of so doing is absolutely astronomical. From an employer point of view, I'm being asked by employers, what was wrong with stakeholder? If you've got more than 5 people, you have had to have offered somebody a stakeholder. Why aren't we just merging this new scheme into stakeholder and making stakeholder auto-enrollment? And it just seems to me that yet again we're laying over and over again more and more regulation. So everybody seems to have 6 or 7 different pension schemes already. Everybody's completely confused, and you're just adding to the confusion.
Before I bring in David, does anyone else on the panel want to come in? All right.
Well, on the first question, I think, yeah, we could say the problem with minimum level guarantee is that where do you set that minimum level? And what is the demographic uncertainty around that? That's what I think a lot of employers will have a bit of a problem, because demographic changes, because is it full indexation or is it conditional indexation? Is there any, there are quite a lot of issues around that, and the guarantee is what I think people will say we will be happy to provide, and I think you will see that in terms of contribution, etc., they are quite high from an employer perspective. But it's the guarantee side in a very uncertain time, which makes it look like a DBS scheme eventually.
To respond to that point, I mean, there are two ways of providing guarantees. There's one, doing it by the scheme using the size of its asset and its continuity to provide those guarantees, and I think that's something that's very interesting, something that can be looked at. The other one is, as with DB, asking the employer to bear some of that risk. Now, frankly, I'd like that to happen, but I think in terms of kind of going with this project, we're probably more on the level of the first agenda. I agree. I mean, with profits has got a terrible name because of the way it was done, not because of the concept, I think, and I think there is room for that. Why shouldn't we use stakeholders? Well, because stakeholders charge such a lot, and that is where your money goes. It's 1.25% for the first however many years, then 1%. I don't want my members to be paying that much for their pensions when they could be paying a lot less, as Ness shows and as David's proposal shows.
Lindsay?
Yeah, can I just say the DC guarantees with profits and so on, the real problem is that I don't think any of us trust government in this country, EU or elsewhere, not to regulate these things out of existence. So, I mean, one of the things we're battling around at the moment with the NAPF is Solvency II. And that will really kill everything in this country if it's brought in, if it applies to pension funds, as many of the continental Europeans would like to happen. So I think the idea of DC guarantees with profits and so on, great in theory, but in practice, we've just got such a long history of seeing what government decides to do retrospectively that people would be very wary about going there. And I'd agree with the gentleman about the legacy problem that we've got. I was absolutely shocked in talking to the NAPF members about the number of deferred pensioners they've got. And we have to find some way of consolidating this because it's just an admin cost killer.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the other speakers. I mean, Luke, Paul is a trade unionist. It would be very nice if you can persuade an employer that there's going to be some backing to it. But let's not make the best the enemy of the good in all of this. Also, you can, through through investment, create some sort of floor, and that might be some way that between that and negotiations with your employer that you can do that. I mean, Bridget, I agree. I think people do understand the with profits. So, look, there is some minimum that we might be providing you with, but there's extra on top of that. That's only the minimum. That's exactly what you'd have if you had a ATP pension in Denmark, and it would cost you how many basis points, Morton, for an ATP pension fees?
It costs
£5 per member per year. Okay, that's as opposed to well, a £100,000 pot and 1.5%. £5 plays 1,500. You can see that makes a huge difference. And look, yes, I think look, we have too much complexity. That's why we're kind of obsessive now in this phase with the RSA of saying, let's get a consensus, which is political, which is across industry. Let's get one that can last, and let's try and rebuild actually what was quite a good system that we built in the 50s and 60s. Looked very like the Dutch system. We managed to unpick that. We've now got something that's enormously complex. Let's get something simple and can take us forward. And I would agree about the cost of stakeholder pension. They are just too high.
Right, we're really running out of time.
If they could, that'd be great, yeah.
We're running out of time, but I'm just going to arbitrarily pick three people. Well, no, because they put their hand up, not just arbitrarily. There's someone here. That would be exciting. And there's a gentleman in a maroon jumper, and there's a lady with glasses.
Susan says, Norwich Business School pension researcher into pension stewardship in the UK and Canada. Going back to what David said right at the beginning, and he talked about trust and John Lewis and doctors as the element of trust of your citizens' juries. Don't you think that what seems to be implicit in that is actually distrust of the pension industry, and in particular the financial industry, and without individuals pressurising for change, that it will be difficult for the audience of this consensus, the policymakers, to impinge the need for change at the policy level politically to change. So I think the focus has to be in what is the industry itself doing to combat the level of distrust amongst the electorate.
Okay, do you want to pass the microphone back?
Thank you, Michael Johnson. David, another great paper, well done. How are we going to convince the DWP that this is not simply a relabelling exercise of the with profits arena that they really didn't like, viz. Their paper last December, which essentially knocked it on the head? And then maybe an even bigger question is, we're really dancing a little ballet of caution here, because to the extent that we are able to increase pensions by 50%, let's say, the politicians are always going to ask a question about the winners and losers, because the real central question with much of your work is effectively an attack on the industry cost base. That's where the alchemy here is no longer alchemy. This means a poorer industry, which I'm all for. It's vastly overcharged. But let's confront it and have that debate way out in the open, because that is what this means. This is a rerun or a parallel with the bankers' bonuses scandal. It's just going to manifest itself much more slowly, and it has to be smashed on the head in the way that I think you're diplomatically doing. So keep at it.
Okay, and then finally?
And I think my point follows very much on from that, and it was going to pick up on Nigel's point about vested interests and who actually will want to drive this forward. But perhaps, coincidentally, being perhaps the last question from the floor, a glimmer of hope. I've worked with Steve Webb, I'm Jan Hindle, consultant to the industry, since the mid-1990s, and I do think, for once, you have a pensions minister who understands pensions and who cares about pensions, and who might actually want to do this just because it is a good thing to do, rather than all the other vested interests that Nigel commented on. So a perhaps glimmer of hope simply in the personality of our current pensions minister, as you say, the 10th in 9 years, or 9th in 10 years, whichever way around.
I'm going to give David the last words. Anyone on the panel want to chip in before I do? No? Yeah.
I mean, all three questions actually sort of drive into the NAPF's agenda, because the trust issue, and essentially all the evidence we have is that employees do actually tend to trust their employer. It's, despite what people say, they really do. And so if you can get workplace pension provision, this is one way of addressing the trust issue. And then everything else that I've said about keeping it wholesale, keeping it at scale, is actually intended to address the cost issues that the other two people were talking about. So this is what the NAPF is trying to do.
David?
Yeah, I mean, look, these, all the questions are really good ones about the industry, and the industry needs to restore trust in order for this to happen. And I always get a little bit concerned, because whenever we write a report, it ends up in a newspaper with being something that actually isn't adding to the trust of the industry, because it's revealing that the industry isn't trustworthy. And that is a problem, because that's not what we want to do. We want to something where the industry does reform itself. And I hear what you're saying, Michael, but we have John Banham, who's the chair of our advisory group. And when you raise this thing about, well, isn't this going to make everybody redundant in the industry? I mean, first of all, it's not, because there's lots of administration and stuff like that that's just not necessary. But also he said, well, I worked for the UK car industry in the 60s and 70s. And we were banging on, wouldn't it be a good idea to make a reliable car that was cheaper and that you didn't need to put in for a service every 3 months? And they said, oh, no, you put so many people out of work. But we put a lot of people out of work in the British car industry. There is no British car industry any longer. That's really the alternative. And look, I'm delighted ATP and APG are working with us here as, foreign suppliers. And if the UK industry won't do this, it will be the loss of the UK industry, because I think we know that you can have efficient, effective Japanese cars that, don't break down. And people will start buying those if the British industry, which is perfectly capable of reform, doesn't.
Well, with that compelling metaphor of the British pensions industry in an Austin Allegro, we'll try. I should know, I had one. Not a pension, an Austin Allegro. we'll draw this to a close. Thank you all for coming, getting up so early and struggling through the deep frost to get here. If you want to take, I think there are some additional copies of the reports. If you want to take some extra copies to give to colleagues back at work, please do so. Thank you to our panel, Mario Lopez, Nigel Stanley and Lindsay Tomlinson, and particularly for a fantastic piece of work to David Pitt Watson. Thank you. Thanks,